One group severely impacted by the coronavirus economic tailspin has been gig economy workers. As Edward Ongweso wrote recently, the gig economy's plan for workers: keep working until you get the deadly pandemic with an unknown death rate, then self-isolate and hope that you don't die.
Sounds great. This is at the same time as companies like Uber push the responsibility of healthcare for their workers off to the federal government. Joining us now via Skype for more on this is Edward himself. He's a staff writer for Vice's Motherboard. Welcome back to Rising, Edward. Great to see you.
Good to see you, Edward.
Good to see you too. Great to be back.
You've been covering, the reality of life for Uber drivers for a while. Let's just start with how this coronavirus crisis has impacted them.
Right. So I think a good sort of reference point is, to also compare what is happening in China with an Uber competitor, Didi. So, in China, just like in the United States, gig workers are expected to, put themselves out there on the front lines, take all the risk, and assume all the responsibility. In China, Didi, suspended service in the province in Wuhan. And then it went out of its way to create alternative fleets, one that was specifically for healthcare workers, and it was scrubbed consistently. And then one that was a volunteer fleet that they helped organize to try to mitigate exposure but still satisfy local needs. And in the United States, Uber simply did nothing. Uber only started to take any sort of action within the last, 3-4 weeks after a massive stock sell-off crashed it to its lowest point and began to crash it to its lowest point since it went public in April. It sent emails out to drivers, trying to say that they're going to provide hand sanitizer, that it's going to provide, some sort of guidance. But this is a company that, can't even provide consistent bathroom facilities for its workers, clean bathroom facilities for its workers, a minimum wage, healthcare benefits. They're left pretty much all alone on this and expected to fend for themselves and to work as long as possible to give Uber as much revenue as possible. And then when they get sick, they're promised a paltry sick paid leave policy, but there's been no specifics on how much that's going to be and if that's actually going to, be something that can actually compensate them and make it be livable, because the wage itself is already not livable.
Yeah, I actually spoke to one of my Uber drivers yesterday and asked him this very question. He told me that in terms of support, Edward, that there is none. That if they get sick, confirmed case of coronavirus, they'll get paid out 2 weeks of their average rate in terms of what they're getting. But then how does that get calculated? Yeah. Because if you look at the average fares that our drivers are getting now, they're talking, some of them, they tell me they're lucky to get one an hour, which is basically less than minimum wage at some point. Broadly, they have not stood up for many of the people who work for them and have made them very rich in the process.
Yeah, and that's, a key part of Uber's business model. I think, for example, New York City, I wrote a pretty exhaustive report of the system called a lockout that they have, where they, imposed a really strict quota system onto the drivers and expected them to meet hourly trip quotas that no driver on average was making. And they claimed that they only ended it, or they're temporarily suspending it for the coronavirus pandemic. But the reason that they suspended it is because, the coverage started to pop up of it, right? And because it makes clear that Uber doesn't really care about the drivers. Uber only cares about a way to position themselves as a good company that can also on the side distract people from how it extracts revenues from drivers without giving them any sort of support network. And drivers know it.
Basically, their whole revenue model is built around misclassifying these workers as contractors, which has, in a crisis like this, you see the massive consequences that has. You also reported on a letter that Uber sent to the federal government asking them for help. Can you just elaborate on that?
Yeah, so the letter was, the CEO of Uber basically telling Trump that, this crisis calls on all workers, regardless of classification, to be protected and have healthcare benefits and have insurance and have the sort of social benefits that would allow them to step back from work. But he used it as an opportunity to push a third category, which is something that he's tried to push in New York and in California, and it's been beaten back. And the third category is basically you're not given the guarantees of employee classification, and but you're given the flexibility of an independent contractor, and it's a way for you to get some protections without the real civil rights of labor. So you'd get some social benefits, but you don't get a guaranteed minimum wage. You don't get a guaranteed healthcare plan. You don't get a guaranteed access to Social Security, to Medicare. But you get a classification that allows the company to not, spend as much money on you as it would if you were an employee, and still satisfy the flexibility myths that these gig platforms push, where they argue that because you can log on at any time, even though they control the price where you go, in cases how long you can stay on and how much the customer pays, even though they control every single aspect of your labor and how you move around on the app, they say that that's flexibility and you should be able to keep that.
So, Edward, one of the things that I'm trying to think about is how this crisis is going to change geopolitics, American business, and all of that. What do you think the lasting impact of this is going to be on Uber as a company and its relationship to the drivers? Do you think this will finally make the drivers fed up because so many of them have just been starved for wages, kind of left holding the bag? And now, the federal government is going to make up some of this in unemployment benefits, but this kind of changes the equation forever.
I think that this has made clear, this in combination with their quota system in New York and in combination with the fights they have in California, has made clear that they abandoned the flexibility argument, and they are scrambling for a new narrative to convince people it's profitable. The question is whether drivers and activists and also the media uncovering it can be critical and objective, or not objective, but I think we need to abandon a lot of the PR that Uber has fed us over the years, which is, that it provides transportation in areas, or that it helps create jobs, or that it helps give people flexibility. And this crisis is a chance to ask ourselves whether or not it should exist in its form as like this global private transportation monopoly. I think, though, from here on out, Uber understands things have changed. In the letter, they said that they are willing to make like a permanent change, but that permanent change is the third category. I'm hoping in some places there will be permanent reclassification. I think California is moving towards that with enforcement of AB 5. I think New York could be the next big battleground for a reclassification of drivers. And if those two places do it, that's almost 20% of Uber's revenue, because it's 5 major markets are in California, New York, London, and Sao Paulo. And that would force Uber to permanently change its business model if reclassification happened there.
Yeah, basically what we're seeing in the service sector overall is either workers are totally hosed because they're laid off. They have no income, no benefits, no anything, just having to apply for unemployment insurance, or they're on the front lines like grocery workers, like warehouse workers, where they're completely overtasked and often without any sort of protection from potentially being infected, and their health and safety isn't being taken into account. For Uber workers, I feel like it's the worst of both worlds. On the one hand, their income has completely fallen off. On the other hand, they're still on the front lines with no protection. What does that look like for them? What is life like for them? And then also, I don't know if you've had a chance to look at the details we're just getting of the congressional package that looks like is going to pass, the stimulus, which does include unemployment provisions for gig workers. How significant is that going to be for these workers?
I think, for a lot of these workers, they're finding themselves with Uber and Lyft pushed into situations where, like you said, they're still putting themselves on the front line. And there's been some attempts to repurpose them for first line of response in either emergency services or critical things like grocery and food delivery. More and more, Instacart itself is hiring 300,000 drivers. But is not going to use the money that it would presumably use for those 300,000 drivers to increase benefits, to allow for sick pay. Instead, it's using this as an opportunity to, pull more money out of the market. So, for a lot of these drivers, it's still even more hours, even though they're getting even less business. I've talked to a lot of drivers who have seen, dropped in their income 60, 70, 80% and find themselves on the road twice as much. And also that time, a lot of that time is still not even active, right? Because there are laws in place that prevent you from driving for a certain amount of hours uninterrupted and require you to take a rest. And even then, they're still on the road trying to position themselves to be in the right place when they're logged back on and when demand hits.
Right.
I think, that this might be mitigated a little bit with the congressional stimulus package, but I don't think that the stimulus package goes far enough. I mean, in other countries, they're covering, 60, 70, 80% of people's income as another factor or another facet of the social distancing effort. And in here, $1,200, for people is not going to do much. 2 weeks unemployment may do some, but also drivers have huge expenses in addition to, vehicle expenses. They have rent. A lot of them rent or lease their vehicles. They have to pay that consistently. They have to pay 2 types of insurance for their vehicle in places like New York City, right? You have to pay all these additional costs that are only imposed on you because you're a driver, and Uber or Lyft or Instacart or Postmates or DoorDash have pushed all these costs onto you. And I don't think that the stimulus bill takes that fully into account from what I've seen, but I also haven't gone through the entirety of it yet. Just some of the details as it relates to gig workers.
Yeah, we're just getting those details this morning. Edward, it's so great to have your perspective and your analysis on all of this. Thank you so much. Great to see you.
Thank you. Good to see you too. Bye.
Next on Rising, friend of the show, Ryan Grimm. He's back to talk about a Biden rocky story in the past in the Me Too era. That's next.